along to NE-RPC this morning. Thank you so much for making along to my early talk for probably for most of you. It is now Friday afternoon for me. My name is Amy. I hail from Perth in Australia, and although it's nice to not have spent 17 hours on a plane, I did actually take the direct flight earlier this year. It's a very long time to stay on a plane. I am kind of missing the chance to get to see a bit more of the UK over there for this conference. So far, I've only ever been to London and a little bit about Bath, and I really loved it over there, so I'd really like the chance to get to explore it a bit more. I do have very fond memories of the UK, if for no other reason than London was actually one of the last in-person conferences I got to attend back in January, and I'm holding out hope that I'll get to do it again next year. I'm a freelance front-end developer, which means I spend most of my time at home in my pajamas or working at the beach. I'm also heavily involved in the Perth Tech community. I help run a user group for front-end developers and the Perth Azure user group. I'm on the committee for the DDD Perth conference, which is the biggest tech conference in Perth. I attend all of the Perth Tech meetups, and I work as an evangelist for YA conferences, and last year became a Twilio champion and a Microsoft MVP. I also have a beautiful grey and white border collie who sits next to me when I'm working from home, and who has actually been getting very anxious about having me home all the time, like he's waiting for me to abandon him again. And today I'm here to talk to you about CSS Grid, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a spec that came to browsers a few years ago and revolutionized layouts on the web. But to start off, I want to tell you a little story. In the beginning, there was darkness and emptiness. And then Tim Berners-Lee said, "Let there be internet." Now, the internet was much simpler in those days. It was just HTML content on a page similar to how we would see in a Word document. But pretty soon, everybody got sick of Times New Roman. And so Tim said, let the fonts and colors and sizes and positions to be changeable. And then there was CSS. Now, we've come a long way with CSS and with our layouts. From the table layouts that still haunt our nightmares and potentially still our days if we're working with email templates, to float layouts and clear fixes and percentage width nightmares, through to rejoicing at Flexbox, where we finally regained the ability to vertically center content again. But now with CSS Grid, we're able to control our layout in both directions. We can dictate how the elements inside the grid behaved. We can reduce the code that we're writing, and even better, we can reduce the thinking needed to make our layout responsive. But what a lot of people are asking is, well, does that mean that Grid is basically the same as tables? No. CSS Grid is specifically designed for creating layouts. It's designed for this use rather than tables which we used as a hack. I do want to add a disclaimer though that tables aren't actually bad. There is still a place for tables. For example, if we're trying to display tabular data on our web page. Tables aren't necessarily bad, they're just misunderstood and misused. And the thing is, CSS Grid can help us get back to writing logical and semantic HTML. We can now write our HTML based on the logical flow of the document and let CSS rearrange it visually if we need to. When this is done right, it means that our content can now be more accessible to anybody using reader mode, saving an article for later, using a screen reader or assistive technology. Thanks to CSS Grid, mocking up or building the layout of an application now not only takes less time, it takes less code. And to prove that, today we're going to build a note-taking app using CSS Grid. We've got a basic HTML structure to work with, and we know what we want the layout to look like. And I'd also like to note that this structure is semantic HTML. No extra container divs, just pure semantic HTML. So we all know what happens next, right? This is when we spend hours fighting with the layout and having to restructure our HTML. Let's see what happens. This is what our HTML structure looks like. First up, we're going to set display grid on our body, which does absolutely nothing just yet. Next, we want to try and break up our application. So here on the wireframe, I've split our application up into 5 equal width columns. Yes, those are totally equal width, can't you tell? With a fixed height header, a fixed height footer, and then most of the content taking up the remainder space of the page. Now, the first thing we want to do is define our columns, and we can do this using grid template columns. So for example, for 5 equal width columns, we can say 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. But I did say that grid means we can write less code, didn't I? So instead, for grid, I could write repeat 5, 200 pixels. Now the repeat function is something we get access to in CSS Grid and allows us to define a number of times and a size that we're repeating a particular column or row. For example, I can write repeat 3, 200 pixels, which would give us 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. We can use any unit we like in here, any CSS unit. We can also define patterns using the repeat function. So I could say repeat 2, 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths, which would give us 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths, 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths. But setting a fixed width also means our layout isn't responsive. So in this case, we could say repeat 5, 20%, which would give us 5 columns, each 20% wide. So this is pretty good. However, then if I want to change the number of columns, say if I wanted 6 columns in the layout, well, I then have to work out what 6 columns would be, and 16, 17 something %. I don't want to have to do that math. Instead, CSS Grid allows me to go repeat 5, 1FR. Now, the FR unit is another new unit that has come with CSS Grid and is the fractional unit, often used in place of percentages, and actually takes away a lot of the issues that we had, particularly with things like working out margins and different gaps. It allows us to define the different fractions our grid is broken up into and the way our columns will resize. So say, for example, I have a grid that I want a 100 pixel wide column, a 1FR column, a 50 pixel wide column, and a 2FR column. I also want to have a gap of 20 pixels between each of these columns, and we'll touch more on the gap property later. What the FR unit would do is it will take 100% of the element width. In this case, it's 510 pixels. It then takes away any existing content, so any predefined column widths. We have 100 pixels and 50 pixels, so it would take away 150 pixels. It then takes into account any gap that we have between columns. Now remember, in Flexbox we used to use margin for this, which got really difficult because it would put a margin on either side. Grid knows that we only want one gap between each column, so 20 pixels times 3 gaps is 60 pixels. It then divides it by the number of FRs we've got in our grid. So here we have 1FR and 2FR, so divides it by 3. Anyone able to do the math for that? In this particular layout, at this side, 1FR would be equal to 100 pixels. So grid template columns would become 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 50 pixels, 200 pixels. And this would then change as the grid resizes, so that the last column would grow twice as big as the second column, with the first and third columns staying fixed. So knowing that, if I say grid template columns repeat 5, 1FR, that should mean that I'll get, because I don't have any existing content, we haven't defined a gap, that should mean that I'll get 5 equal width columns, which I do. Next, I want to have a look at the rows of my layout. So again, we've split this up into 3 rows with a fixed height header, fixed height footer, and I want the content area in the middle to take up all remaining space. And this is really easy to do because I can set grid template rows. I can set 100 pixels for the header, 50 pixels for the footer, and I can use the FR unit to allocate the remaining space in the layout for content, which does this. Now, you may think that that looks the same as it did before, but what we had before, it was actually taking up the full height of the page. Because we've dictated that our first row is only 100 pixels, it's staying up there. So you can see some of the elements have stuck to there, some are overflowing. The next thing we want to do is to start to lay our elements out on a page. So we want the header to take up the full width. We want our sidebar to take up the second and third column. We want our content to take up the remainder of the second row, and we want our footer to take up the remainder of the third row. There are several different ways that we can do this with grid. One is to define which grid lines the elements will start and finish on. So if I have a look at my grid here, these lines are actually numbered. So here, if you can read my writing, we have our lines numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if we want our header to start at the beginning of the grid, we can tell it we want it to start at line 1. So for the header, we can set grid column start 1. Now we want our header to go all the way to the end. So we could set it to end at line 6. But then if the size of our grid changes, we need to change that. The good thing is grid numbers aren't just numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're actually numbered backwards as well. -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6. So instead we can define that our header should go to line -1 because -1 will always be the edge of our defined grid. So we know the header is always going to be full width. Whether our grid is 1 column wide or 100, our header will continue to take up the full width at the top. So we can set grid column end -1. There is also a shorthand property, which is grid column, and there we can set 1/-1, 1 to -1. If we set that, that will push our header all the way out to the remainder of the first row and has pushed the other content down onto the second row. Now, next, we want to do the same thing for our sidebar. Again, our rows are also numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, -1, -2, -3, -4. So for our nav bar, we can set grid row to be from line 2 to line -1. So from the second one to the end of the grid. We can do this, or alternatively, another way we can define it is to just give it a size. So we can say grid row span 2, so it should span 2 rows, and then we'll let the grid place it where it needs to be, which in this case we'll keep it where it is. It'll just push it down so it takes the next row as well, which if you're able to see right at the bottom there, it has gone all the way down where the other elements have it. Next, we want to push our main area out. So we can set it to be grid column span 4. So then our main should span 4 columns. And finally, so that will push it all the way out, which has then pushed our footer down onto the bottom row next to our sidebar. Finally, we want to place that footer in. So we want the footer to then take up the remainder of the grid to fill the whole thing out. And we can do that using grid column span 4 as well, which will push the footer all the way out to the edge of the grid. Now, this is pretty cool, but another thing that we can actually do with CSS Grid is we can define areas and we can give them names to make it easier to place elements within our grid. So where we've set the grid template columns and grid template rows, we can define grid template areas and assign names to each area and show where multiple elements should span multiple sections of the grid. So here we have one row for each row, one line for each row in our grid, and one word for each column. So here we can define that the header should take up all 5 columns on the first row, the nav should take up the first column on the second and third row, the note should take the remainder of the middle row, and the footer should take up the remainder of the third row. If we set this up, then instead of defining our grid column and grid row properties, we can simply set grid area on each of the elements within our grid and assign which areas they should sit in. So header gets grid area header, main gets grid area note, nav gets grid area nav, and footer gets grid area footer. This is where it's really useful if you're using Firefox. Firefox have really great developer tools, including the grid inspector, which allows you to inspect a CSS grid that you've set up. We can see overlays of the particular grid areas, their names, line numbers, and exactly where everything is sitting. So I recommend you have a look at that. So we've done the basic layout of our app. Cool. In 7 lines of CSS. That's pretty impressive. But if we have a look at our wireframe again, our content actually has most of the note in the middle, and then we have an aside sitting on the side with a bit of information about that note, which isn't what we currently have. So currently it's got the note and then the aside is sitting underneath it. Now, what we can actually do to push that one out is we can set on main, we can set display grid to that one, which will create another grid inside of it. Doesn't really do too much with that just yet though. Next, we can define how many columns wide that we want this new grid to be. And so for this, I want it to take up the same columns that our main grid does. So I could set grid template columns repeat for 1FR because our main element takes up 4 columns. I know those will match up. But there's another cool thing with CSS Grid where instead I can set grid template columns to subgrid. What subgrid will do is it will actually then take into account however many columns that element takes up and will create those columns within the internal grid. So here we have the note area with our main still taking up that area, but the 2 elements inside of the main have now taken up the first and second columns of that new subgrid there. Finally, what I can do then is I can use grid column to get my article to push out to take up 3 of the columns inside my subgrid. To push it out, the aside will take up the final column, which will fill out the grid exactly where I want it to go. Now, subgrid is still relatively new, so I recommend having a look. MDN have some excellent docs on how to use this. If I take away all of my beautiful colors, this is looking pretty good. This is a pretty awesome layout. While this is nowhere near a finished project, this is not too bad for the amount of code that we've had to write. But I also want to have a full view of all of my different notes in, in a grid. So here I want to set a new grid layout. But this time when I set my columns, I want to have it nice and wide, so I could go repeat 10 300 pixels. The problem with that is then I need a fairly wide screen to do that. I might not be able to fit 10 of them in there. So instead, I can use another property that CSS Grid gives us, which is Autofill. Now, there's 2 of these. There's Autofill and Autofit, and they work kind of similar. What the difference is Autofill will fill the row with as many columns as it can fit, even if we don't have that many elements. Whereas Autofit fits the currently available columns and then expands to take up extra space. So you can see here, Autofit, the top one, is only putting in as many elements as it needs, whereas Autofill is still putting in implicit columns even though that doesn't have the elements to take the space. Or if you like, you can just switch between the two of them until you find the one that works with what you're trying to do, which is what I do. So I'm going to set grid template columns repeat autofill 300 pixels. So remember, if we're using autofill, that will create as many columns as we can fit, even if we don't have enough elements to need them. So if I've only got 2 notes, it should still create extra columns for more notes. Another thing that I can do as well is I can set it to be grid, I repeat autofill min-max 300 pixels 1FR. What that will do is then if my grid doesn't quite have enough room for another item in it, for another column, it will spread each of the columns out, so it will resize them, it will increase the size of them in the same, so they'll all stay equal width, but the grid will continue to take up the full width available to it until it has 300 pixels spare, when it will put in another column. So min-max allows us to define a minimum and a maximum size for a particular column. Again, we can use any CSS unit we like. We can use pixels, viewport widths, viewport heights, ems, rems, FR units, whatever we want. We can use that in min-max. So 300 pixels, 1FR, should be 300 pixels wide, but they'll then grow to take up any remaining space so that the edges of my grid still line up with the rest of the content properly. Next, I want to define some rows, and again, I'm going to use autofill, so I want it to put in as many rows as it can fit, even if I don't need them, and I just want these to be 150 pixels high. So this is still left room for extra rows, even though I don't have the elements to need them. Lastly, I want to add a gap between each of my columns and each of my rows. So I can use grid column gap to define a gap between columns. I want to set 20 pixels. I can use grid row gap to define between rows, 20 pixels, or I can use the shorthand, which is grid gap 20 pixels. Now, why is grid gap so much bigger but better than using a margin? Because of this. If we had to use Flexbox and use margins for gaps, we'd often have to use negative margins so that things would still line up properly, whereas gap takes into account the fact that we just want a gap between each item. We're not assigning it to everyone, so the edge items don't have the margin. So if we use this gap, this will add a nice equal gap between each of our items, which is pretty cool. If we have a look at the grid inspector again, we can see here that we can see where the grid gap is between each of the columns and rows and all of the extra spaces that we have available. So all of this sounds a bit too good to be true, right? What could I possibly have missed that would ruin how amazing this sounds? Yeah. So browser support is better than what you might think. It's been around for a few years, and the browsers actually did an amazing job with testing before they launched. So Chrome has had it since version 57, Firefox since 52, Safari since 10.1, Edge since 16, and you know what, believe it or not, IE kind of supports CSS Grid, which I'll touch more on later. All in all, this equates to about 90.86% of browser support in Europe. Remember Subgrid, the really awesome thing I showed you about? So yeah, that's currently only available in Firefox. Firefox had it available in their nightly browser mid last year, and it came into production in December last year. However, unfortunately, no other browsers are working on developing that particular property just yet. Flexbox, which you may be familiar with, has been around for a little bit longer, and you can use it as a fallback or in addition to Grid, and that we're looking at about 98% support. Now, the really cool thing with using CSS Grid and using CSS is it's also really easy to make sure we're not delivering unsupported code to browsers because we have a thing called the supports query. Now the supports query, similar to a media query, except it allows us to define a CSS property, a value, and insert CSS code in there. So for example, we can set CSS to display grid, supports display grid, put our code inside of there, and if the browser doesn't know what to do with display grid, it won't process the code inside of it. The one problem is this guy. So IE was actually the first browser to implement CSS Grid. However, they did it way back in the first version of the spec and haven't actually updated what spec they're using. So IE thinks if you give IE a supports query for grid template for display grid, it will go, oh, I got this, I can do it, I know what to do with grid. But a lot of the properties that we're going to be using, IE won't know what to do with them or will process them differently. So instead, we can do a supports query for something that IE doesn't know about. For example, grid template areas. So I can set support grid template areas, put my grid code inside of it, and then if the browser doesn't know what to do with grid template areas, it will ignore my code. Oddly enough, not all browsers support supports. However, the good news is if it doesn't support the supports query, it will ignore the code anyway. And if a browser doesn't support supports, try saying that 10 times quickly, it will have no idea what to do with display grid anyway. But this sounds really awesome, and so you're all going to go back to work and say, there's this really cool thing I learned about and we should use it. And they're going to go, but. So I've taken a few of those buts and I'm going to give you some answers that you can use to give back. So, but there's not enough support. 90.86%. I don't know what your user base is like, the browsers you're having to support, but 90.86% is incredible. It's amazing. And we have the supports query, which means we're not having to deliver unsupported code to people's browsers. But then we have to write a fallback. Guess what? Does your code currently work with those websites, with those browsers? You've already got a fallback. This is something that we don't have to go through and rewrite. You can go through and write a new grid layout inside of a supports query. Your fallback is already there ready to go. But we don't have time to do all of that. The secret is you don't actually have to use grid everywhere. Pick a component, a page, a section of your website somewhere. Use grid there and go from there. You don't have to use grid everywhere or for everything. Pick somewhere, start using it and go from there. But then we'll have to maintain it. Guess what? It's CSS. Not a framework, this isn't JavaScript. There's no dependencies. This is just CSS. This isn't something you're going to have to continue to maintain, which is probably better than the alternative that you're currently using. So, summing up what we covered today, CSS Grid is awesome. The end. Okay, so CSS Grid is amazing, and I do think you should go back and start to use it in your workplaces. To do that, I have a bunch of resources available for you. CSS Tricks has a really amazing guide to Grid. Have a look at it. I still look at it every day. This is an incredible resource to have a look at. If you'd like to get a head start, Wes Boss has a free online CSS Grid course. Even if you don't like watching online courses, I recommend having a look at this anyway. I hate online courses and I really enjoyed this one. If you're a little bit more old-fashioned, that's not a dig at you, I do have this book, actually the physical book. I bought the physical book. This is a really amazing book by Rachel Andrews, CSS Layout, going through CSS Grid as well as a few other layout techniques. Pretty much anything by Rachel Andrews is amazing. She does a lot of really cool stuff with CSS Grid, and I would like to credit both her and Jen Simmons with inventing Grid, but I'm not entirely sure how true that is. Jen Simmons also has a bunch of amazing stuff. If you would like a more fun way to learn, there is CSS Grid Garden, comes from the same people who did Flexbox Froggy, where you can learn how to write CSS Grid by watering plants. I also have the code for this demo available on GitHub. You can check it out. It also has a particular branch with where I go through the various different steps we went through in the presentation today. So check that out. Awesome. Thank you much for having me today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I'm going to try and stick around for as long as I'm awake. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.